Gonna kick us off.
We're like,
Yeah. Well, hey, everybody, welcome to there we go. Restart again. Welcome to Creative Week. This session is on measuring creative. It'll be led by Carrie and Jillian, who can introduce themselves and just get into it.
Awesome.
Thanks for all for joining us.
Okay, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Carrie Weens. I am VP Client Partner, and I've been asked to work on the measurement presentation today because of my background in go-to-market strategy and connecting brand and demand campaigns and what that means as we start to look at that full funnel.
and I am Jillian. I'm Associate Strategy Director. And why I'm qualified to talk about this, for however long I can remember, even at 90, when we were trying to kind of build out our brand measurement capabilities and brand tracking, a lot of what I do sits on that in regards to research. And what's interesting about, I guess, my career so far, the whole decade of it, I started off in social media and analytics, and I was sitting very closely to the data and performance of how our posts performed every single day. So I was very in the thick of the data and looking at little things like engagement and impressions and click-through rates. And now what's interesting is that now I'm kind of sitting more top of funnel, where I get to look at, consumer research and brand perception studies. So it's a really interesting mix, and it's interesting to see how this industry has evolved. So
Yeah. So what we're going to talk to you guys about today is we're going to start with just talking a little bit about how we think about brand to demand. And then we're going to move into what's happening in the industry today that's causing a lot of questions around how to measure these and what that means from an ROI standpoint. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, so how do we then go about as marketers thinking through this journey and turning our dots into lines, which we'll make sure you understand what that means when we get there. And then we have a quick example and some time for questions. All right. So kicking it off, when we think about brand versus demand, the key thing that we're trying to kind of get across here is brand is really about working to establish trust over time. Whereas with demand, we're really looking at driving immediate results for specific products or solutions, usually among key audiences or verticals. So what does this mean as they start to play together? So some of you have seen this slide before, and the idea here is that as we think about brand and demand coming together in market, brand is pitching and demand is catching. What this means is brand is going to be reaching your total addressable market, our widest coverage. And what we're trying to do here is make sure that we're really establishing that position in the marketplace. Who are you and what does your world look like? And we're going to do that in ways that help generate interest and brand affinity over time. Whereas when we're looking at demand, we have the opportunity to have multiple campaigns here sitting under a brand umbrella, right? Because we're going to start to drill in on demand in terms of what is the ideal customer profile for the program you're trying to bring to market, because you're trying to generate interest in a particular solution or drive revenue for a particular product or offering. What this means is that as we start to think about driving engagement in the demand side, we're going to have multiple different stories, but at the crux of them all, we're trying to solve a problem and bringing a differentiated solution to market. So what does this mean in the context of measurement? Well, we know in today's marketplace, the big struggle that we're having is that marketers are having to make strategic choices about where to put their budget and investment. So some of the questions that we start to hear out there is, what is the right mix of investment across brand and demand? How do I justify investment in brand advertising? How do I measure that ROI of my brand investment? And should I shift my budget from brand to demand to drive short-term results? But potentially, what does that mean for my long-term success? So we're not going to answer each one of these in this question. In this presentation, it's going to be a little bit more hypothetical, but we're going to talk about how we approach it and really what to think about as you start to kind of bring these things together. So handing it over to Jillian.
And you're probably wondering, I didn't sign up for a lesson on the difference between brand and demand. I signed up for a measurement session, but we wouldn't be marketers if we didn't set this up with a story. So we all kind of know this. I don't want to like belabor this point, but we all know that at any given point in time, not everyone is in the market for your product. As a matter of fact, like I think 5% of the market is in the market to buy every single quarter. So you are actually not necessarily reaching people and talking to people who are ready to buy. So if you flip to the next slide, I guess I have, I don't know if I can reach it. So that's why it's really critical for, brands to kind of always be in front of consumers, not just with a short-term lens, but also from a long-term perspective. So when people are ready to buy, they kind of already have your brand top of mind through your effective advertising in the past. And we're starting to see the shift in how marketers are allocating their budget. And a lot of this was driven, not necessarily driven, but exacerbated by the pandemic, because before, it was almost a 50-50 between short-term activation and long-term marketing. But because of the pandemic, brands, people have just really stopped spending, especially in B2B. They only have money to buy toilet paper back then. But, they really started to put their money into brand building activities because no one was ready to buy. So they really wanted to be top of mind. So this is not always going to be the de facto case, but I think it's just a good anecdote to think about why marketers are really thinking more long-term.
And just to play off of that a bit too, when you're looking at that bottom pie chart there of the 40-60, we often sometimes see that flipped depending on what your brand awareness already is in a particular market, right? Or with a particular audience. So this isn't meant to say this should be the exact formula. We're just trying to show you how things have evolved over time and what to consider.
And even I think I read an article Airbnb even was investing more in brand building activities. And it's well, everyone knows it's Airbnb, but they still want to, invest in their long-term success. And I feel like everyone's probably heard this too, but in every interview, when I talk to even an IT person, well, why did you choose this, this provider? And they're like, well, I never got fired for choosing IBM. So it's just really interesting how important familiarity is, not just among the decision makers, but also among the entire business, because familiarity plays an incredible role in not just reputation, but also building confidence. And if you flip to the next slide, I think there's this inherent notion that, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the density of these charts. But there's this inherent notion in B2B buying that, it's less of an emotional purchase, and really it's not, because your reputation is on the line when you make this type of purchase. So you really want to make sure you get it right. And that's kind of, I think this chart just represents the quote previously, you never got fired for buying IBM or suggesting IBM, because you start to see that sliver of 5% here in yellow, which stands out among this dense slide. But really only 5% of people, if you're not aware, only 5% of them actually make it onto your consideration set if you haven't been aware, or they didn't make it on your day one list. So familiarity plays a critical role. And this next slide, I think a lot of people have seen this before, probably more times than we can count. But brand does show up. So I think we want to make sure this is not just a siloed thing that we're talking about, where Jillian only does brand and Carrie only does demand, which, our titles might suggest otherwise. But they really work together because, brand shouldn't stop. Brand is never turned off in the entirety of the customer journey. So every opportunity, every touch point, there is an opportunity to do brand building, and there is an opportunity to measure all of that as well. So it shouldn't be thought of as silo, and it shouldn't be thought of as, oh, we can only do brand measurement at the beginning of the campaign and we can only do demand at the end. It should be thought of as a cohesive journey into itself.
Spectrum, if you will.
A spectrum. Thank you, Dan. I did forget I have a couple more slides, but this is kind of how we used to kind of think through now we're kind of we're bridging the gap to measurement now, but this is kind of how we used to think through it, where I guess I'll ask you guys a question, like, why is it that, we're really focused on the bottom of the funnel metrics, and we always have been in regards to immediate prospects?
Most clients want to see.
Immediate ROI.
Immediate ROI, yeah. Anything else?
Other money terms.
Yeah, I mean,
The brand metrics are more soft, so I think
Yeah.
they find it hard to.
Exactly.
Find it time.
It's
hard to measure.
Yeah.
Measure that.
yeah, it's more concrete. It's easier to tell your board that, hey, I, generated X% of leads or number of leads, whatever. And I guess historically even, brand health has never really been something that has been at our fingertips all the time. Like, this is a relatively new kind of metric. And all the new sophisticated technologies that we have at our fingertips is coming to life. And I think that marketers are able to kind of see that and start to connect the dots a little bit more. So we're starting to see this become a little bit more of like a cyclical type of thing, where, we kind of have this separated, but, these are all the different types of strategies and all the different types of, measurements and activations that you could generate between brand and demand. But, they really shouldn't be thought of in silo, and they really do impact each other across the entirety of the campaign. I think this was just an interesting visual to show you that they do work together, and measurement should be done across the entirety of the funnel. Oh, wait, there is another slide. Yeah, so there's a lot of data points. There's a lot of things to measure. And this guy is an agony because he doesn't have a single tool. He doesn't have a single measurement to report back to his client. And he has to do a little bit of extra work to try to create those stories. So that's kind of where, Carrie and I, we kind of talked about, this idea of dots, turning your dots into lines, where the dots kind of represent all the little data points that we can kind of connect to tell these lines, ergo stories, that we tell clients that kind of demonstrate, I guess, not only just success, but also how we can optimize campaigns to improve them.
So let's get into a little bit of like, how do we actually go about this when we approach it? So one of the places that we start is really around identifying the questions that the business needs to answer. So to do this, we try to do workshops at the beginning of the engagements for these types of programs. And that workshop itself is going to be a combination of folks from the business and from the core agency team. So from the business, you're wanting to have different voices in the room, from marketing, sales, product, potentially corporate comm, maybe PR. And then from the core agency team, we want to make sure we're representing folks from creative and from media, because all these different opinions are going to help you understand what's important to them in the business, and then ultimately how we start to prioritize objectives for the campaigns. Organize and prioritize the different KPIs for the campaigns. So when we start these workshops out, they tend to be about a half a day. And we want to first begin with aligning on the core business objectives. So an example up here is perhaps you need to grow brand in a key market. So if that is the core business objective that we are trying for on the brand side, and then perhaps there's improved quality of leads from a key audience or vertical on the demand side, we want to make sure that we have that lens as we're thinking about the different questions and how those questions relate to kind of the stages of this funnel here. So what you start to see as we move into this pink is, so that brand awareness part of the funnel, this is going to really be trying to answer those questions around where to focus, right? So this might be things where if I'm trying to grow my brand, what does that mean to me? Am I trying to grow it because I need to be associated with certain emotions? Am I trying to grow it because there are people who aren't remembering my brand and I need to increase unaided awareness? Am I trying to look at the market compared to the competition and I need to grow brand because the competitors are stronger in a particular key market? As we start to go kind of towards that, where we're trying to attract more of those demand metrics or those short-term metrics, we're looking back at that IDP. So who is that key vertical or audience we're focused on for this particular program? And we're looking more at questions here that tend to be things like, understanding where this account is in their journey. And we've talked a lot at TMP about marketing qualified accounts and marketing qualified leads. The point here is we need to make sure that we're understanding the relationship between both here, but in the context of what they're doing in their journey. So are folks engaging with certain types of content? Your creative team members might want to know what topics, right? What kinds of formats are they engaging with that are going to help me evolve what I'm putting out into market and the information they need? It might be things more around the job titles and the persona groups and how they are engaging that inspires the media team to come up with new tactics and placements and optimize over time of where we find these folks or how we segment them within certain media platforms. And then as we start to think about a little bit wider, we might be trying to answer questions for the business of like, what industries are actually surging if I'm going after maybe a C-suite audience and now I want to focus in on a particular vertical for a new campaign because I saw that finance is a really key vertical here that we're starting to see a lot of interest in that we haven't before. And then finally, in that last column there, the drive revenue, these are usually the ones that get prioritized right off the bat, right? Like we need to see sales meetings. We need to see that ROI. We need to be able to prove that we have opportunities attributed to our campaigns, but we don't want to just jump to that endpoint. So this workshop helps us get all these questions out into the open. And then with all these questions, we can start to prioritize. And when we prioritize, we're looking at a couple different things. We're looking at the availability and the quality of the data. So what are we going to use at the end of the day to justify behind this? If your Salesforce is a mess, it's going to be really hard to tell the story you want to later on, right? So that might not be the best case scenario to really push those Salesforce metrics higher than potentially some other metrics, right? If we are going to do a brand tracking study, are we able to get a volume big enough of folks that we're trying to reach that we can make a justified opinion? Or when we start to reach out there and scour it, do we only end up with like 30 voices answering our survey and we don't feel like it's applicable to the whole market? So those are some of the things we want to think about. Also with prioritization, we need to think about impact and feasibility. So at the end of the day, again, we're answering questions for the business. So we could have a whole laundry list of questions here. Doesn't mean we can't find that data for you as we need it coming down the road. But when we think about kind of our golden KPIs or the main ones we want to focus on, what impact are they going to have on the business so we can tell the right stories to the stakeholders to justify continuation of programs, added budget, where we might need to invest further. And then we take it down a lens. So now we have all of our questions for the business, and I've kind of summed them up so that this slide doesn't get super long here. And we start to identify the key performance indicators or the key metrics that show how we're going to measure that, right? So if one of our questions was, I want to be able to talk about extended reach within a particular vertical, then we are going to start to look at impressions. Impressions tell us reach, right? So that's going to be a very key metric from the media team. If we're going to start looking at potentially, it could be things around the brand emotion and how people relate to our brand. We might be looking at things like brand associations, NPS scores, customer satisfaction. As we start to look at, who's engaging with our brand and where are they coming from, we're going to start to look at click-through rates, downloads, conversion rates through our funnel, right? And then finally, as we start to look a little bit more about those revenues, this is where we're going to want to see, are we causing change? Are we seeing the velocity in the pipeline shifting? Are we starting to see that, we are getting folks at the right stages in their journey, that they're actually shortening those sales cycles, or we're actually seeing ourselves improve the average deal size over time because we're getting to the right people. And we're getting to the right heart of that buying group. So this is where we start to kind of do that next layer of like, let's map out those KPIs. And then finally, it becomes, now where do those KPIs live? So what platforms and tools and potentially brand studies and third-party research do we need to do to connect all these dots so we can tell that bigger picture story? All right. And then ultimately, what do those stories look like? So here's just a couple high-level examples. But for example, if we're looking at, potentially that I want to grow my brand with a new audience, this might be something like we're seeing in the top right here, where at the end of the day, we want to be able to come back hard to the stakeholders and say, hey, we went out to grow a brand with a new audience, and we are becoming more known to the C-suite audience because we have seen ourselves move from 28% CXO level engagement to 68% among our key accounts. That's a very strong story that is supported by the data. But again, it goes back to that earlier question and aligned to our business objective. Another one could be, we have improved customer satisfaction scores. We actually saw a 30% increase in our Net Promoter Score over the last 12 months. So all we're trying to show on this slide is, like, at the end of the day, how do we make sure that the story that's going out there is concrete, but we're not leading with data, we're leading with the, basically we're leading with the answer to the questions that we've been trying to solve this whole time. There we go. All right, we're gonna walk through a little bit of an example to try to just bring it a little bit more to life. So I know a number of the folks in the room have seen the Alteryx case study before. For folks on the call, there is a more detailed Alteryx case study on our website, and we're also happy to walk through it at a future date. So I'm not going to get into the creative and the story and everything behind it. I'm going to talk more about what they wanted us to achieve and how we kind of went about doing that. So with Alteryx, first of all, for those of you who don't know Alteryx, they are a data and analytics provider. What this means is they have tools to help you prep, blend, and like use data in meaningful ways so you can kind of come about stories. So it works really well kind of in the context of this example of building stories from measurement. And the overall, like the concept and the story behind the brand that we kind of were bringing to life for Alteryx is this idea of Alteryx for all. And this idea stemmed from, you don't have to be a data scientist to be able to use and understand data and make insights from it. Everybody can do it. So when Alteryx came to us, they were really looking to do three big things, right? So the first was increase brand awareness. They were in a very competitive market and being outspent. Establish a global brand presence. So this meant, like, we need to be seen, and we need to be seen consistently. And so this kind of sparks this idea of like always on content, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And the third one is they needed to actually generate measurable demand. They needed to be able to prove the ROI. So what you can kind of see on the right is a little bit of how we went about their go-to-market strategy. So what we did is we kind of divided our campaign into three segments, as you will. There was the brand segment, and the brand segment was going to be able to really kind of focus on those first two a bit, primarily that first one of like, let's get the brand out there in highly impactful ways. So let's look at out of home, let's look at events, let's get it on full page takeovers, let's make sure we're reaching that total addressable market. The establish a global brand presence and keep it always on meant that we were going to start to bring that brand story into a demand story, right? Because we want to be always on, but we want to make sure we're getting folks back to site, and we want to make sure that we're starting that conversation that's going to lead into a demand conversation. So this is where we've used a lot of social and search tactics that were global in presence, and we're building off of the brand story in terms of look and feel and content. And then the third one here, as we move really farther down the demand funnel, were independent lead gen campaigns. So going back to those ideal customer profiles, when we met with Alteryx, we identified three particular groups they wanted to get in front of that would have their own unique stories because of the problems they were trying to solve in the market. So one of those, for example, was Office of Finance. They wanted to get in front of anybody who worked at finance within certain enterprise companies, and they wanted to make sure that they were clear on what data prep and analytics for all meant within the finance sector. So you can start to see how these all work together in market. They're serving a bit of a different purpose, and the media tactics and channels we used start to help segment them a little bit from what's hitting that whole wide addressable market to what's hitting very niche markets.
A quick show of hands. Who knows what a brand tracking study is? All right, a fair bit of people. All right, I guess I'll explain. So a brand tracking study, and this can come in various forms. This is kind of just like a larger way to think about it. But a brand tracking study is something that, we can do internally, but we can also utilize a partner. And we basically send out a survey to audience panels. And what that is people who are not necessarily associated customers of your brand. And they fall within the audiences that you're trying to reach. And we send them a survey that just kind of asks questions like key things about awareness, perception, ad recall. And we try to do that at the onset of the campaign, ideally before the campaign has started, but even in the early stages, I think is sufficient. And then we kind of use that as our benchmark. And then we ask the same questions throughout the campaign just to kind of track change over time to say, hey, is your brand building awareness within these key markets among these key audiences? And a lot of brands actually launch these studies. You can use them outside of just brand building campaigns. You can use them for any product launches. Are people aware of the specific product? You can use it for competitive analysis. You can do all these types of things with brand tracking studies, but the intent of it is really just to get in front of people who don't have that bias towards your brand to kind of understand, all these types of metrics and also like things like intent as well. Like you can kind of tap this audience that you can't really, understand on like web listening tools, for example. So I guess I'll take part of this and then Carrie will kind of
Weave
add
in and
on.
out.
Yeah. So we launched Analytics for All, and then we also launched a brand tracking study to understand and measure get that benchmark, that baseline of our metrics of awareness, perception, et cetera. And then we also did a remarketing survey. And what this is, actually, I don't think it exists anymore. So, but the idea of it was really nice. But essentially, it's like, how you see those YouTube ads pop up that say, do you recall seeing which brand? We were able to do those types of ads through this campaign. We also looked at Blue Ocean, which really gave us, it's kind of like web listening that looks at, things like, what are you doing online versus your competitors? What is your tone of voice from a subjective standpoint? What is your audience talking about? Share of voice, et cetera. Just to kind of look at, how we're comparing against the cohort. And then we also did a couple things in addition to another survey, because we love surveys. But we did some we call this a lead gen survey, but we were able to, build out a survey and send it among our contact lists to kind of understand how they came into the funnel, what they're looking for, consideration, et cetera. So it was just kind of an interesting way to, insert a lot of these methodologies along the course of the campaign. And I guess so we're not kind of going back and forth, all hit the very end. But we did another brand tracking study, wave 2, just to kind of look at how, the creative, and I hate to say just creative, because there's a lot of things that go into brand performance than just what we do from a creative perspective, like things like, PR can also impact a lot of these. And that's something that, we may or may not be affiliated with, conducting their PR efforts. So just to know, it's not just creative, it's like the whole entirety of the brand itself. So just want to, I guess, call that out to make sure that it's like your brand and not just the creative.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, and the other parts of the methodology are just, regardless, we're not always just looking at studies and surveys, right? So some of the other things that go into making sure we're thinking about a full measurement picture are things that also relate to like audience and creative testing. Like we want to make sure that we're learning and improving over time so that as we're understanding those different dots that are coming in, that we're continuing to kind of look at the different stories that come out of them. So with Alteryx, that meant we tested out some different persona type messages in market, right? And that was at both the brand level and the always on demand. We looked at different creative strategies in terms of what type of imagery and copy headlines and things like that worked on what types of formats, making sure that we're always looking at ad creative in relation to where it's running and not just using the same type of ad creative regardless of setting. We segmented campaigns. So within the media platforms, we looked at, can we start to segment out audiences that we can tell are higher up in the funnel versus those showing intent? And you can do this in a number of different ways, whether you have tools like a Sixth Sense, right? Or if you're just looking directly in like Google platform. But basically trying to kind of use that different type of intelligence to help us start to tell different stories based on where these folks are. And then finally up at the top there too, integrating Salesforce lead data directly into platforms so that again, we're able to kind of start to use that as another measurement on top of the segmentation kind of data to look and optimize within platform based on what's really happening. So all of these different kinds of tools are helping paint that fuller measurement picture.
So we have a couple examples of the stories that were an output of the studies that we did. The first story is, kind of about emotion and perception. The democratization of data was a relatively new concept when it came to, IT having the reins of all of the data and analytics, or the data team kind of living in a silo and kind of being a gatekeeper of a lot of that data, to now line of business being able to have access to all of that and becoming decision makers of these types of tools as well. And we saw at Blue Ocean that like Tableau and Power BI, they are market dominance in the space. And they were also trying to own this. But in our initial brand tracking study, we noticed that like there was a lack of humanity in this industry. I think in the first session that Dan did, we saw like an ad about people, and it was like just someone holding like data points. And it's like, well, this doesn't really like, convey humanity whatsoever. Which, does make sense. And this, I feel like this data proves that to be true. And we noticed this opportunity for Alteryx to be able to kind of own the more human element, because we also saw that people saw, out of all the brands that we tested, people saw Alteryx to be the most empathetic compared to everyone else. And we thought this was kind of a really interesting insight for us to lean into, especially when now we're talking to non-technical audiences. So how do we speak to them in an empathetic and human way? And, that led us to the next phase in the campaign, where we were able to say, hey, like, how can we elevate our storytelling, bring more humanity into this? And I think there were even like stories from current customers that we used on like billboards, and that just kind of lent itself really nicely to a space in the market that we could own. I don't have an example of that, but the second story that we shared, there's only two, don't worry. We were kind of worried when we saw the wave 2 results, because awareness was down, and we were like, oh shit, like, what do we do now? But what was really interesting to note was that awareness was down across the entire industry. And that was because of the economic downturn. A lot of people and a lot of brands in the industry were pulling spend from their marketing efforts. And that resulted in a decline in awareness across every single brand in our cohort. So you're like, okay, well, this is a really interesting insight. How can we also make use of this data? And we asked questions relative to like creative impact and brand perception. And we were able to learn while awareness was down, ad recall was actually exceptionally high. I think it was about 70%. And people really remembered the Alteryx advertising that we did. And then we could see that, our creative was actually kind of delivering on the brand positioning that we were intending it to do. So we're able to generate more, I guess, emotions or perception of innovation and reliability. And that was all due to a lot of the creative that we shared. So this was an interesting insight for us to kind of look at, but just to kind of show you the range of, we can look at other things beyond, oh, hey, like awareness is down or awareness is up. Like we can really dive in deep into the data to really understand like things like creative impact or intent. Any questions on those? Yeah, don't be shy.
At what point do you, when it drops, like, do you change tactic and like, how far down does it have to get before you're like, oh no, let's fix this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to answer that. So the question, if you couldn't hear it, was at what point do you change tactics or strategies if you're starting to see potentially a decline in awareness or a negative result from what you're seeing. And I think for us, the big thing here is starting to analyze why that would be. Because to Jillian's point, if we're spending less money, then, changing tactic could mean something different than if the problem was more because you weren't able to make the penetration you needed to in the market. So I think what we want to do first is identify what the actual problem is and then work through a little bit of what are some different solutions we can take to that problem and do some testing. And then start to find a route that we want to take.
And I think what's interesting to note, a lot of these brand tracking studies are done, it could be done every 6 months or 9 months. So it's not like this is like frequent data that we get, in real time. Although there are some instances where we could set it up to get stuff more frequently. But I think, maybe looking at some other metrics like, click-through rates or leads or something that can be more frequent that we can act on more quickly might be better metrics to look at to make very quick pivots. Whereas these types of studies are kind of more long-term based studies, where, we typically look at them either through our QBRs or, HBR.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually you're stealing my slides, so I'm
Oh,
gonna
I'm
jump
so
there
sorry.
and then we'll come back. But I was gonna say,
Sorry.
I was gonna say, don't get lost completely in just the studies and the surveys and things, because we also want to make sure we're not forgetting the platform metrics that are available to us that can also help shape that brand activity story, right? So what we mean here is like, we can refer to them even as easy metrics because we're able to kind of get an answer from them, right? So we're gonna be able to look at web traffic and engagement and understand if we're seeing an increase when the brand is in market versus when it's not, right? We're gonna be able to look at potentially search volume and ranking. So for example, if we've recently launched a product campaign and we're seeing that branded search for that product is increasing, that has a direct correlation. We're going to be able to look at things directly with, partners and specific brand lift studies potentially that kind of goes with that third party, but it's using a different methodology in here. And because we can run audio, connected TV, and so many other things programmatically, we can look at the impact that those are having in the market, and what that means as we look across channels and tactics and how they're impacting each other. There's often a very good correlation between when we're looking at search and programmatic display, or when we're potentially looking at social and display and market together. So we don't want to kind of keep everything in a silo, and we don't want to just look at one form of data because there is correlation.
And it's interesting to get in, I keep saying it's interesting. It's very interesting. It's all very interesting. But, oh my God, I forgot what I was saying. It's easy to get into a routine where, we work as silos, right? Because it's easy to get this data. You can just go to the analytics person and say, I need this to tell my story. But, I think great stories come when, you put all the different pieces together. And that's, I think, when, innovation and change come.
Yeah.
But I guess, do we want to go back to that other slide? So back to brand tracking studies. So I just want to talk about some considerations here. I know we all probably just got so excited to do brand tracking studies now. But I also want to be honest about, what we've learned along the way is, brand tracking studies are an investment, obviously from a money standpoint, but also from a time standpoint. It can take upwards of 6 to 10 weeks from designing a question guide to, recruiting panels, all the way to reporting. So it's not something that can be done it could be done in a month, maybe. But we typically like to give ourselves some time at least to be in field, especially if it's a very niche market. I guess I'm going to skip to number 4 because it's kind of similar, but if you're in a niche market or you're trying to talk to, let's say, executives, And bear in mind, an audience panel, each person gets paid to take a survey. Sometimes, maybe if you're looking for a CEO, they might be very hard to reach and they're like, oh, I'm gonna charge like 50 grand to, that not the case. But sometimes one-on-one interviews might be better than a survey to be able to track a lot of this data, and that's something that we can do as well. We're obviously a global agency and we want to hear from, local markets around the world. So consider like local languages and translations for a lot of these things and different types of cultures that we need to consider. And then also, I've been fortunate to have a media person sitting next to me. But brand lift studies can also be intertwined with a lot of this. And that's usually done through media buys, and platform buys that they can offer that, typically done with like a minimum spend. So yeah, just some considerations to take into account.
So all that said, now that you've heard about measurement for an hour, we have 3 key takeaways. First one is strike a balance between generating new leads and fostering relationships. So this is kind of back to the very beginning of the presentation of talking about those short-term and long-term. We want to make sure that we're not isolating either and that they work together. Because without the long-term maintenance of your brand, your short-term activity is going to definitely be impacted and you're not going to see sustainable growth. The second one here is brand and demand should be thought of as a unified strategy wherever possible, because we definitely don't want to be isolating these two out, and we want to make sure that we're thinking about how they work together in market, particularly because your audiences don't know that you're running a brand versus a demand campaign. And then the last one here is start with the questions you want to answer, and that's really going to help you as you start to think about KPIs measurement.
And I'm not a data scientist yet, but I feel like sometimes we can make measurement complex and sometimes it doesn't need to be that complex. Like we just need to kind of break it down and, think about what is the story that we're trying to share and what is really going to make me look good to my board. So really not thinking about, how can I answer 50 million questions? Like what are the core things that is going to show success?
Any questions?
So quick question on literally what you just said though, Julie.
What did I say?
The questions you're going to ask for success. I think would love your 2 cents on this. I would say that there's probably an angle with that, with the data you can access, right?
Exactly.
Like if we can't get
Yeah.
access to certain Salesforce, if we can't get
whatever,
you kind of have to, I think a lot of times you can start out with clients and have this idealistic view of what you're trying to prove or show or, your outcomes. But when you get into the weeds, the data you can access is a lot smaller. So you kind of have to get back down into what's reality and what can we really like show the needle and push the needle on, right?
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's it. And that's
Yeah.
something that Carrie, I think you talked about earlier is, accessibility to the tools and, maybe Blue Ocean is something that, is not in our budget for the year. How can we gather some of this data in a different way? Yeah, but also like just being honest and saying like, if we want to have a measurement plan, this is what we need to invest in the long term, and just kind of say like, just because we can't see this data now, like how can we in the future, and then just kind of work towards that as well. It is an investment, like I said, but if it's proving value, I think it's worth the conversation.
When you get like the results from the brand tracking study back, is it all? Like, do you just get metrics and you're left to extrapolate any story behind them, or do they give you like the why behind?
Let me restate that for the folks on the call because it's a little hard to hear. So there was a question of when you get the data back from the brand tracking study, basically, what does that look like? Is it just all the dots and the data points and you have to extrapolate the information into insights?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scoots. I think it can be both. Sometimes when we work with some partners, they do provide us with an end report with some insights and key learnings, but we always ask for the data tables to look at, okay, well, how are different audiences looking? And that's how we kind of found some insights between line of business and IT with the Alteryx example and data scientists. And we were only able to gather that because we really dove into the data. And sometimes they only give us top level insights. So it's our job to kind of extrapolate the insights. When we do it in-house, you know, it's us just, we have Qualtrics and the platform allows us to kind of dive deep into like cross tabulation and all those things. So we're actually looking into the data itself to try to make a lot of these stories.
So like when you give the example of like, oh, their awareness went down, but then did they tell you that awareness is down across the industry, or you were like, well, let me figure out why? And you discovered that.
I mean, they give us the data, the data that suggests that awareness is down across all different competitors. And then we try to like extrapolate like why. We kind of pair that with what we're seeing from an industry lens as well, to try to layer on like, why might this be happening? Did we turn everyone into measurement geeks now?
Any other questions?
You ever posed it like if we're doing say a rebrand as a sort of before and after? I don't think I've done that, but I don't think anyone else here has done sort of like, let's look at your old brand base. If we did the rebrand, we have a base to see rise, because we often find when we've done a rebrand, it's impossible to track the benefit. Yeah, so like
Yeah.
we're always doing it later on. We would never pose an approach to say for the old.
And that's typical, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say for those on the phone, the question was around starting to look at brand tracking studies potentially for a rebrand to make sure you can set a benchmark ahead of time, and then you're able to prove the story out from original brand to rebrand versus sometimes we wait a while and we take the brand tracking study for the rebrand. So just making sure that you're thinking about timing and relation.
Yeah, and that's typically why we try to, as best as we could, launch a brand tracking study before the launch of any type of campaign, because it's able to give us those baseline metrics for the campaign prior. Alternatively, we could design a study that like asks questions about how people look at the previous creative versus the new creative and how that might impact, you know, perception or how you what you associate with the brand. So we can design it like that too, but yeah, in terms of timing, that's always really why we try to do it before the launch of anything. Are there any questions from the phone, folks? Nope.
All right. And thank you all.